Hi, my name is Amanda Ridding. I consider myself an amateur student in law, and to try and help others understand law, I'm doing my best to put together short, concise videos. In today's video, I want to talk about the construction of law, understanding how law is constructed and why it's constructed in a certain way can definitely help people better understand it, not interpret, understand it when they go to apply it. And so I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I've done a really sort of just a quick cursory example of how a law can be said. So I decided to create a law called animals. And so animals is the subject of the law. Now, a lot of laws will next be followed with a purpose. I didn't put a purpose in here because it was done. I was doing this very quickly just so I could get the concept out to people. And also you will have often laws that'll have a preamble. So an example of that would be the Canadian Bill of Rights, 1960, my favorite piece of legislation in Canada. Canadian Bill of Rights, its purpose right at the top. So the title will be Canadian Bill of Rights. The purpose below it is an act of recognition, a recognition and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And then immediately below that, there will be a preamble. The preamble in the Canadian Bill of Rights, or whenever you see a preamble, the preamble identifies a subject or subjects that the rules that follow must be subject to or defer to, okay? So a preamble the preamble sets precedent. It establishes the subjects and all the rules that follow. You must keep the subjects of the preamble in mind when you're reading the rules that follow, because the rules that follow are all subject to the subjects in the preamble. I don't have a preamble. I don't have a purpose here. I just jump right into part one. So the next thing you need to understand is when they write law, because there's so many different parts that may need to be considered, they break those parts down to their commonality, So in this sense, I did a law about animals. So there's common elements about animals with respect to feeding and vet care. And then I break it down to dogs and cats. Okay, so part one is common elements, part two is dogs, and part three is cats. Now you're also going to see that there's a lot of arrows and they're all going upwards, they're all going up. And the reason for that is law, when you read it, is to ascend. It is to ascend. So the next thing you need to understand is when they start breaking the subjects down into parts, the first couple of parts are going to have they're going to establish one or two things. They're going to establish the most important subjects that need to be spoken to and or the common elements of the whole, the common elements of the whole act of legislation. Okay. The reason they do this is because if they establish the common elements up front, it can reduce on redundancy, because rather than having to rewrite 5 rules over and over and over again, you can just refer back to that part or to that category and say, including the rules from here. So instead of rewriting the rules over and over again, you can take it and with one sentence go back here. So that's that's why it has to be above, it has to precede, because everything under must ascend. It relates to what's above it, not below it. And then you break down under the parts. You can break down just the rules, or sometimes it'll be a combination of breaking down the rules and recategorize. And when you break down the rules, some of those rules may relate to the part and all of the part, and some of those rules may have additional commonality. So when they have additional commonality, you will make subcategories under the part. Okay, so when you take a look at mine here, you'll see I have part 2 dogs, and I have the general rules that immediately follow dogs. And then below that, I have rules that are specific to poodles, but because poodles are a dog, they are underdogs. And I have another subcategory for German Shepherds. And because German Shepherds are dogs, they fall under dogs, but because they are their own unique category, they get their own unique category. Now, the names of a part is important because when you see the names, whether it's the name of a part, a subcategory, or the name of a rule, every one of those names is identifying a subject. So the rule is subject to the name of the rule. The rule is subject to the name of the subcategory, and the subcategory is subject to the part it's under, and the part it's under is subject to the law. Now, further, just to add a little more confusion to it, you can also get, like for instance, we have the common elements for feeding and vet care. So I told you that instead of having to write that out every time, I can with one rule attach it in another part of the act. So under dogs, I put rule 3 in addition to the procedure set out in part 1 for the common elements of animal care. So I actually, it's an incomplete sentence, but that's how I would start the sentence. And then I would finish it with something along the lines of the additional procedures are set out below. Okay. So by stating that, I have now attached part 2, or at least some of part 2 to part 1. So where part 2 is missing procedural components, you can now go to part 1 to get those components. And I'm going to add that every time you see a rule that sets out procedure in law, the way I understand it in law, that is considered a procedural component. And sometimes those procedural components are essential. Sometimes those procedural components are essential. So going down, poodles relates to dogs, and because dogs is attached using rule 3, it can relate to part 1 as well as relate to the title. Okay. Then you have German Shepherds, and German Shepherds, they relate to part 2, but they can also relate to part 1 because of rule 3. And then of course they relate to the title. And then you have a third part. So again, they're all animals, but because they have different differences, they're categorized by their differences. So under cats, I only did like one rule. So two rules. So the first rule under cats is rule 7, in addition to the procedure set out in part 1 for the common elements of animal care. Okay, that rule 7 now attaches cats to part 1. So part 3 is subject to part 1 and is subject to the law being animals. And then under rule 8, it's the rule about cat litter. So that identifies what the subject is about. Rules about cleaning cat litter so rule 8 is the rules about cleaning cat litter. So that rule is subject to the title of the rule, which is subject to the part it's under, which is subject to part 1 because of the rule attaching it to part 1, and then of course to the law of animals. Hopefully that makes sense. I recorded this, so if you have to, you can watch it more than once. But the idea is that I'm going to be covering some pretty intense law in the next short little while, and having a good understanding and foundation in this is going to help you understand the research I've been doing, which I'm going to be doing, which I'm going to be starting to share again in bites. I'm going to try and keep each video to specific topics, and that's just for additional clarity. Thank you very much. Take care.